program might contain strong language. If you think you may be offended, switch off now.
Hey everybody, welcome to Watch Mojo and the Inside Mojo podcast, where each week we're looking back at 20 years of YouTube history through Watch Mojo's unique lens. I am your host, Rob, and with me, as always, is Watch Mojo's CEO and co-founder, Ashkan Karbasfrooshan, who is back again from New York City. How's it going, Ash?
I don't know where I am. I don't know where I'm waking up. I'm a bit disoriented. No, things are great. Things are great. Life is good. Knock on wood. Just very happy. Just very grateful. Everything's amazing, to be honest with you. So I'm just happy to be seeing you again. And but yeah, back to New York next week. So
oh wow, 3 consecutive weeks.
You know, even in the era when I was like trying desperately to raise funding, or I was like meeting clients to try to generate business, and I would go to New York like 20 times a year, I would never actually be there back to back, because I would usually like be returning, sitting on the tarmac in LaGuardia. Somebody would text me saying like, oh, sorry, we didn't get a chance to catch up. When are you back? And I was like, yeah, there's no way I'm returning like next week. I was like, oh, I'll be back in a couple of weeks, just because I needed to kind of, drum up some traction. But this month, as we had discussed why, like it's been very hectic, very productive, working on a special strategic operation, to paraphrase Vladimir Putin, not that I usually like to do. So got to go back next week, but no complaints. It's the greatest city in the world. So it's
awesome.
Fun.
Well, we were talking about our favorite heavy metal bands before this call, and now we're shifting gears to legacy media. So we'll try to do that, put ourselves in the right mental space to do that. Can legacy media make a comeback? That's the theme of today's episode. And I want to, before we get into it, I want to mention our poll, because I think it's really interesting. I don't want to forget.
We didn't mention it per se.
Exactly. So what we want to know, go check this out on Watch Mojo's YouTube page. What form of legacy media do you miss the most? TV, radio, print, or early internet? And I acknowledge that TV, radio, and print still exist, but they aren't the dominant forms of media that they once were. So which ones do you miss the most? Weigh in, and we'll get back to you at the end of the episode.
Which one do you miss the most?
TV. I would have to say, just the experience of, I think I suffer from decision fatigue a lot of the time with streaming, where, I'll sit there and scroll through all the options and not end up choosing anything sometimes. Whereas back in the day, you could just like put on a channel and watch whatever's there. I kind of miss that.
Yeah, I'm not ADHD, but I do have short attention span. So I think the traditional model of linear TV, actually, I loved it, but it wasn't. I much rather like on demand. I do like to be able to choose what I want to watch. For me, it was probably, if I think about it, obviously I like music. So radio was very like nostalgic, but it's probably magazines. Like, when I was working in a convenience store where I got held up, like honestly, for me, like reading magazines, one of the influences of WatchMojo, along with encyclopedias and cable TV. But magazines to me, both like when I was in the convenience store and just like killing time when it wasn't like super rush. But also, we talk about self-made people. When I go, that's not really true. You stand on the shoulders of somebody. My dad, for bringing us here, he was an entrepreneur. He isn't, well, he's retired, let's say. He's still with us, knock on wood. My brother, who was 3 years older than me, he was a consultant. And so he would like order The Economist, Business Week, Fortune. So one reason why I did pretty well in school without really ever cracking open a book was because of all those magazines. So a lot of my kind of knowledge base is magazines. And I actually think while newspapers never made sense because of like the timely aspect, to quote Warren Buffett, he's like, yeah, man, if we had to reinvent, do things all over again, he's like, you're not going to hire a bunch of people to ride trucks, to go up, lumberjacks, cut trees, cut paper, print stuff. Like obviously newspapers don't make sense, but I feel magazines, especially like bespoke or special edition, something you leave on a coffee table, something you read, like at an airport, I find like magazines to me will always even have a place, but obviously a much smaller place. So good poll. Curious to see what people have to say.
Yep. And Joe, our colleague, just wrote here in the chat, I learned guitar with magazines and radio. So, hey, there you go. You can do a lot with...
And if you combine those two with a bit of TV, you got YouTube, which is how people watch it now. Back to that.
That's actually how I learned guitar, was on YouTube in like 2003, 4, 5, around that area. So you mentioned your trip to New York, and you've said in the past that the democratization of media has made it so that you didn't have to travel so much. But here you are making frequent trips to New York. Why is that? And what can you tell us about that?
Sure, the great restaurants. No, I'm kidding.
Well, undoubtedly, that's part
yeah,
of it.
and last week I referenced it's like the Babe Fest Olympics, where every country has attractive women, but like New York has, it's like a congregation of women from around the world that make you just walk into poles. No, so yes, you know what? Let's bring it back to the show and the theme. It's not just the democratization of media. It's that we were lucky and we were smart and we have a great team that we had success. So once you have success on YouTube and you have like programmatic revenues, things we've discussed, and you have a big audience, you have like a direct distribution to a large, critical mass, then yeah, you did not really need to go meet investors in New York or the Valley. You did not need to go pitch to Madison Avenue. But our success, and to this show's theme, can legacy media make a comeback? They did not really embrace YouTube. They were kind of head in the sand. So, after 20 years, and 5 years with our great investors, I do have a responsibility to them as I have a responsibility to the team and to our audience. We started to get a lot of companies, and it's weird that I'm transparent about this, but I've said it's because when I was younger, that nobody talked about this, right? Mm-hmm. If it's helpful, great. So we've had a lot of companies to reach out and say, hey, we would be interested in welcoming WatchMojo into our fold, adding WatchMojo to our portfolio of brands, or in many cases, we are going to go really big in digital media or in content, there's no way that we could really build organically ourselves. We don't have the experience, we don't have the competency, or mainly even if we do, we don't have the patience. So we want to make up for lost time. And, the first company that reached out, I thought it was an anomaly. The second and third, I was like, okay, this starts to look like a pattern. And then despite the uncertainty of like the elections and the tariff stuff, it became clear that, yeah, everybody has failed to really address the video, AVOD, YouTube, kind of target. Mm-hmm. And WatchMojo is, to quote them, I didn't say it, we are one of the few investable or acquirable assets. Even Mr. Beast would be tough to acquire, even though he's done a job of building a business. But most individual creators are extremely difficult to acquire. And then you're not going to go buy like, Eminem's channel or Taylor Swift's channel. Those ultimately belong to the record labels. Yeah. You're not going to go buy WWE's channel because that's a company, even though, I guess William Morris did. But the point is, we've been having these meetings and it's great, but it does bring up the theme. And again, it's funny how this show, like I was 6 months ago on the beach during vacation, you emailed me saying you want to do podcasts. And I was like, oh, it's 20 years. Somebody else said, Young Deuces, one of our, creators was our talent, was like, we should do a documentary on WatchMojo. And I was like, you know what, let's do a documentary on YouTube through our lens. And here we are. And it's just like the way that we're in like show number 18 and this has happened. It's just, I'm like, as much as I'm agnostic, I'm sometimes like, is there a higher force that is bringing the stars together?
Yeah, we might be closing this podcast with a new chapter for WatchMojo.
Yeah, and again, it's not planned. Like I don't have that kind of power. So I actually don't. I think while legacy media can definitely make a comeback, I do think it's more like improbable, but not necessarily impossible. Because they're not. I mean, here's the thing. Already in 2025, just putting legacy media in one bucket, I think is already a disservice. So I thought today we could maybe break it down a bit and talk about certain print media and how they've done, and then look at like broadcast and even cable TV. And then before we dive in, you have to bear in mind that even the disruptors get disrupted. You've heard me, the team has heard me say that we disrupted, let's say, the VH1s, the MTVs, whatever, by embracing YouTube and by kind of rethinking videos and top 10 lists. Yep. But even we are not untouchable. And, Yahoo and Alta Vista, the first directories in search, were disrupted by Google, that today itself is being disrupted.
By ChatGPT.
By ChatGPT. And yesterday, Google made a series of announcements where they're kind of disrupting themselves. It's not just them, even if you think of like MySpace or Friendster, these were the first social networks.
Wow.
Oh my God, that's even the Friendster before my time. I don't remember that logo. But yeah, so Friendster and MySpace, there's Tom. They got disrupted by Facebook, which itself you could argue, my God, great job, Ivan. You're a rock star there. And you're reading my mind. We got to take this on the road. Anyway, no. So the disruptors get disrupted. Nobody is untouchable. So we could look at a few companies. And like, we'll look at a few companies and just like standalone, but we could also talk about, again, in the world of YouTube, what have they done in the world of video? So you're the boss. You take it however you want to go.
Yeah, well, let's go through the list. You provided a really good list of companies that successfully transformed themselves, legacy
Well,
companies,
just to be
media
fair,
companies.
just give credit where credit is due. And this is, again, a theme of the show. So I was actually, because we did the show and I was like, gotta pack again. As I was doing my laundry unpacking. So I asked ChatGPT, where I think is a tool. It's not like going to replace anything, but as an add-on, I call her Chassis, short for chastity. I asked her to give me names that start with CH for chat, that had some of the letters GPT. She suggested chastity as one of them, which I liked, certain pureness to it. But I thought it was a bit too on the nose. So I went with chassis to kind of, anyway. It's also chassis, like I'm the engine, she's the chassis.
Oh, okay, so you work together in harmony
That's the only way
to move forward.
There you go. Mankind, humanity, and machine together yields a better outcome.
Yeah, great combo. All right, well, first one on the list is the New York Times company. And yeah, that's great because they've embraced the web as a traditional newspaper. They've gone to, they bought that Wordle game that was viral a couple years ago, and they've done all kinds of things.
Well, spot on. The main thing I would say that they've done is they actually took the risk and say, hey, if you make content available for free and you condition your audience like Pavlovian dogs, they will just expect it to be free. And journalism costs a lot of money, whether it's journalism with a capital J or with a lowercase j. It costs money to send people out, out around the world and, cover beats and whatnot. But a little fun fact, just again, always tying back to YouTube and WatchMojo, in like 2010, well, before we had kind of found our product market fit, they had already acquired About.com. And in some ways, About.com was similar in text to WatchMojo, in that they would have like an article on every topic, the way we'd like to have a video on every topic. So About.com, which was owned by New York Times, wanted to buy us. And I remember trying to explain to the team, like Rebecca and Stephanie and Kevin and Derek and everybody, that I was like, look at the work you're doing. Even though at the time you could argue we were just an expensive hobby, like going like a leaf in the wind. I was like, yes, it would be for the About.com unit, but I'm like, New York Times, arguably the gold standard of journalism, they want to buy us. So I'm like, look at like what kind of validation that is. But yeah, so I think the main transformation for them is they brought on Mark Thompson, who I believe is a Brit, not that it matters, and he basically built their subscription business. And yeah, then they bought like Wordle. And what's funny is they were really smart to skim the market, meaning like they would even make like most of the content free. But then they were like, if you want cooking recipes, that's even like an add-on, which you would think people would be like, yeah, screw this. But it worked. And today they're largely a subscription business with like it's a freemium model, right? So there's like a premium version and a free model. Now, they did buy Wordle. They did also buy, I think, The Athletic, for about, it wasn't a huge grand slam for the investors, but I mean, it was still a huge outcome. But they've actually struggled with video because even more recently, under the more recent regime, they always kind of were open to looking for outside help. But ultimately, I think that is a challenge. Like when we look at, legacy media, there's Mark Thompson. When we look at legacy media and can they adapt? Yeah, one reason is because it's like the Microsoft problem. If this shit wasn't built here, then it stinks. It's like we had to build it for us to embrace it. And if you're the New York Times, like even if we do like, that video we did last week of like images that may not stand the test of time, they would be like, well, you know what, we should do that. Our journalists should do that. So again, more power to them. But I think it also shows that, yes, they could reinvent themselves, but they reinvent themselves in a very like evolutionary way. They did not really revolutionize themselves. They did not really disrupt themselves. They just said, hey, we're fine with less viewers if that means that a large portion of those viewers are subscribers that pay us. So
yeah,
but they get it. They get like a B plus. Overall they get an A. But again, because we're looking at it through the lens of video, New York Times, I love you. You don't get an A just because your video strategy laisse beaucoup à désirer, as they say. And if you want to do a partnership, we're here. We love you. Just not like calling you out, but again, just being fair. B plus.
I'd say that's fair. They've retained their reputation as a premium news outlet, so I think that's a success.
Yeah.
We've got Disney at number 2. That's a big one because the streaming industry is massive, and Disney was kind of like a no-brainer to get in there with Netflix and start competing because they have such a massive library of shows and movies.
Yeah, so I mean, you got to give credit first of all. So Michael Eisner is the gentleman who, when he was CEO, this goes back probably 15, 20 maybe years. He's the guy that said we're going to kind of like greenlight these movies, whether it's Aladdin or Lion King or Beauty and the Beast. That really, I think, gave Disney like another, growth spurt. But then he got replaced by, well, he resigned. I think he retired. And then he got replaced by Bob Iger, who's like, a legend, a great person. I've never heard anybody really speak ill of him. Considered running for president, later on. But he really is the guy that transformed the business, and he's the guy that him and Kevin Mayer that bought Pixar, Marvel, and Lucasfilm. Yeah. That I looked, and when they did that deal, and I told the team, I'm like, this is going to be a transformational event, not just for Disney, but for the entire industry. And that's really when I said geek culture is going to overtake pop culture. These movies, these IP are not going to be, buried in the backyard. And so they deserve a lot of credit. Now, more recently, you could argue that they overpaid for Fox. But okay, I mean, at the end of the day, that's moot because Rupert Murdoch was not going to sell, for nothing. But the key is that then Kevin Mayer, who, by the way, now at Candle Media, a few years ago, we talked to them about a strategic partnership because they had bought a lot of like Reese Witherspoon's studio. They had bought Coco Melon or Moonbug and stuff, to their credit, which some critics would say they overpaid because of the timing. Like they raised a ton of money, I think, from Blackstone. Not BlackRock, from Blackstone, I think. And you could argue that they started to buy at the peak, but that's not their fault. That you don't control that. And you could argue they overpaid for some assets, but they'll figure it out. But the few assets, even if they overpaid, like Moonbug, paid off because they have dominant franchises now. And so Kevin Mayer and his kind of team, they're the ones that spearheaded Disney Plus, which you could argue was that, I say sins and virtues. Was it driven by envy and greed for what Netflix was doing? Hell yeah. But Netflix was crushing it. And that takes balls. Everybody, Iger, Mayer, everybody involved, because they were willing to blow up their house, burn their house down in order to be relevant in the 21st century. Yes, you could argue that, like, was it smart to overdo and dilute the MCU franchise? Okay, in hindsight, you could say that. Could you argue that, like, they burned some bridges with theatrical? Sure. But theatrical exhibition is going to be, going downward over time. So it is what it is. But I think Disney is actually a bit more interesting because they also own Hulu. They still own ESPN, which you could argue has been disrupted. But I mean, if you really put it all together, I do think Disney Plus, that direct to consumer, the number of households that buy Disney Plus the way like our generation looked at Netflix or YouTube as a must watch, I give them an A-, to be honest. I really do. I think like they really, really bulletproof their future. And I always want to be careful with this. I might have sold my shares recently just because I wanted to put it elsewhere, but allocate the capital elsewhere. And I didn't think it was going to accrue that much. But Disney long-term, I mean, having an ever-growing base of direct consumers that pay you with their credit card. You're not at the mercy of, we got to put our movies in AMC or Regal's theaters. That's an A+. That's an A-, and it could very well grow into an A+ over time because they got the direct-to-consumer part down, which they actually never had. And then this year, for the first time I went to Disney World, I had gone on a Disney cruise. And then I'm like, Jesus freaking Christ, that business generates $50 billion in revenue. And that won't go to zero at all. If anything, that's going to grow. So they get an A-, to be fair, in my opinion.
Yep, Disney's not going anywhere. I wanted to also note that I know that with a lot of fans, Disney's kind of burned a bit of goodwill, like especially with franchises like Star Wars that have a lot of diehards and stuff like that. But they've also done cool things too. Like you mentioned the 21st Century Fox purchase, taking all of those kind of dormant superhero movies and then integrating them into the MCU in cool ways, kind of like gave life back to those movies that had fans that were just like, okay, well, this is not relevant anymore, but like now it is all of a sudden. So that's pretty cool.
And, I like your intellectual honesty because, again, like last week, Air Canada, I mean, I love Air Canada, but you could argue Air Canada like kind of tried to shaft me or their system by sending me, instead of direct the Montreal LaGuardia corridor, they were like, why don't your flights cancel? We're going to send you to Toronto. And then from Toronto, and I booked another flight myself. But this week, again, I'm flying Air Canada. As much as I'm like, I may never fly Air Canada. Like, again, so when you have that brand loyalty or goodwill. When you have a great business, I mean, consumers could be whining or whatever, but loyalty doesn't evaporate overnight. So
yeah. All right, next up on the list, the Washington Post. So how does that compare to the New York Times as
So,
another
now
big
that we're
newspaper?
now that we're doing this, I love chassis, but maybe I could have, if I wasn't traveling, I should have like bundled these in print. So we're kind of going back and forth, but it's all right. A bit of variety, curveballs. You don't know
Sure.
what's next. So Washington Post, again, you could argue early on that they've missed the boat and whatnot, but to their credit, I think especially when Jeff Bezos, even though he's hands off, when he bought them, I did feel that like he brought in a certain, again, Jeff Bezos, great visionary, excellent operator, blah, 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 and also flawed. I'm not saying these people are perfect, but regarding this, your report card is on this. He was a bit of a both. He brought the vision and he also brought stability. When he bought it, it was like kind of like, you don't have to worry about the near term. And so I do think that like the company had a little bit of a extended runway to also say, oh, look, sure, maybe we're going to look at what New York Times did and others are doing, but we're also okay to maybe have less of a reach and ergo less impact, but we need the subscription revenue. So this one, I know I gave New York Times a B+. This one, I'm actually going to say, even though they've done a lot to improve, and also, again, in video, I'm not sure they're anywhere near figuring that out. And you could argue maybe print-based news sources may not want to have a strong video business because it's just a different experience, right? That's fair. But I give them a B for the simple reason that I think at the end of the day, a lot, even the New York Times, when you decide to go paid wall, when you decide to charge, you're making a decision to take profit today instead of like maximize your purpose long term.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're going to reach less people. Less young people are going to turn to you. Less older people are going to, continue to be like your client. So while I give them props for figuring out subscriptions, I do think in a way that they kind of mortgage their future. And they're not as diversified as the New York Times, right? The New York Times does have a lot more assets, whether it's Wordle or The Athletic or many other things. So while I give them props for figuring out the subscription business as a grading exercise, B.
Would you say that compared to streaming services, which also have a subscription model for newspapers, isn't it a certain type of person also who gets a subscription for a newspaper? So you're limiting not only the volume of your audience, but also the scope in terms of what type of people are reading your stuff.
100%. You're very right. I mean, the point is already everything about newspaper was already a dwindling market. Even reading newspaper, when you could read bloggers, you could now podcast. There's a lot of niche publications. There's a whole generation, this is passe, that like read Gawker or back in the day Weblogs properties instead of New York Times. And there's a lot of bloggers who are domain. I'm not just going to use myself because I'm familiar with my work. Like if somebody really wanted insights into like digital media or entrepreneurship, no disrespect to the great journalists there, but those are generalists. Those are people that interview people. So it's kind of like diluted. They get some facts wrong. Great access, great reporting. But like you're going to read what Ash has to say about YouTube. You're not going to go read their journalists who are like reporting on YouTube. And again, I'm just using myself as an example. I'm not being literal there. So yeah, you're right. I mean, they're basically shrinking their business in order to have, to just get more money up front.
A couple of questions from the audience. Have paywalls had an effect on the evolution of the newspaper online presence?
Yeah, I mean, it limits it. I mean, that's basically it. Search engines don't really index you as well. I mean, I assure you, even though search engines sometimes will land, the New York Times or Washington Post on the first search engine results page or SERP, for sure, they don't get the same juice as websites that are totally free. But that's a choice they make, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I know we are very like, oh, we'll do this topic. We'll figure out how to make money later. Yeah, in more corporate boardrooms, it's like, show me the money right now. Like they may take a quarter or two or a year to be patient, but for sure they're limiting their future. In the next generation, well, not forget the next Gen Y, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, they could care less about New York Times by and large. They're never going to care about New York Times. But that's also where some of these companies are hoping that like an Apple buys them. It's not that crazy. Apple News, they could be like, hey, there's something here for retention, for goodwill. Let's just buy the New York Times. That is not impossible. So some of these companies view this as a bridge. They view the subscription as a bridge before a greater fool comes along and pays a higher price for your assets.
Right. And I think we answered the second question. Do they limit the otherwise broad access that paper had? And the answer is yes.
Of course. I mean, we could have also thought of like subscription, and there's a lot of people that have paywalls, but I always am a kind of mass reach as many people. Information should be free. To me, that's one of my principles. I don't mind, but I'm also fortunate that, again, it's like I get if you're the New York Times, you have journalists, you have to pay.
Totally. Number 4 on the list. So we're shifting to television broadcasting with the BBC.
Yeah. Well, the BBC, to be fair, their website also has articles, just to be fair. But yeah, it is ultimately broadcasting. It's UK. Now, the reason why the BBC is a bit different is like I mean, in Canada, we would call it a crown corporation. I don't know if that's the lingo. It probably is in the UK. So they kind of are basically taking taxpayer money and then basically like floating their operation. I think the BBC, especially with like the BBC iPlayer and just like the fact that they've retained, oh, by the way, a little parentheses, a lot of Iranians hate the BBC. So I'm not, if anybody is watching, I'm not defending the BBC or Ayatollah BBC in the context of Iranian coverage. Don't come out and attack me. I'm talking about generally what the BBC does as a business, covering everything. Okay? Exactly. Sure. So BBC, I think, has done a good job to stay relevant. We've met them on my trips to London. But I also think that BBC could have been a bigger global brand, saying we're no longer just limited to TV in the UK. They could have said, because of the internet, the BBC still has a lot of goodwill or brand value. We're going to go for the world and we're going to make everything open because we are funded by the government and we don't have the same, on the one hand, we don't have the same pressures that a, LLC corporation does with shareholders and stuff. But what's the flip side? When you're funded by taxpayers, in a way, you are at the mercy of the taxpayers. If you do something, the taxpayers can call you out. They could call for budget cuts. It also becomes very political. In Canada, when we had elections recently, one of the candidates, Pierre Poilievre, he made attacking the CBC, which is Canada's version of the BBC. That was one of his main things. He was like, we're going to cut the CBC. We're going to screw the BBC. F the BBC. And okay, whatever. I get that. I get that there's a lot of people that are like, why are we funding the BBC, the CBC or BBC? But I mean, my point is it's still a public service. So to them, I do again give them props for the iPlayer and many other things, but I give them actually a B- because I think there was a lack of imagination. If I was running the BBC at that era, I would have gone and said, hey, we are going to make the BBC into the premier news information site in the world. Period. You're not happy? Come in a year. Judge me in a year. Tell me what I did wrong. But give me a year. Give me 2 years. Give me 6 months. And I don't think they went for that. I think they went straight for, how do we just survive instead of how do we thrive when now you have, again, no barriers in any market. So to me, that's a bit of it's a B-.
What grade would you give the CBC?
I mean, I know some people at the CBC. So again, this is not like a shot. I actually look, are there things that they do that drive me crazy? Hell yeah. And as a person, as an entrepreneur, but also the CBC looked at acquiring us over the years because they also were like, I'm not saying this is like to brag. It's to show they did look at global reach. They did look at like the YouTube audience. So they have thought of it. And if they thought of it with us, they thought of it with others. So it wasn't a lack of vision. The CBC, this grade reflects just Canadian media. And I don't mean no disrespect to Canadian media. I'm a proud Canadian. My passport is there because I'm getting on a plane again very soon. Canadians need to leverage the fact that it's a great country. It's a great people. Why are so many freaking Canadian singers and comedians so popular globally? Because there's a certain finesse, there's a certain texture, there's a certain substance, there's a je ne sais quoi about Canada. As much as I love America and as much as I like the UK, the Canada stands out. But Canadian corporations just lack vision. They do not execute. Their head is in the sand. Look at Post Media, the publisher of the Gazette and all these other things. Kevin and I, one of my partners in crime who helps me on the business side for 20 years, we'd go see these companies every few years. Nothing would change. It would just be like slowing down time. Their head would be deeper in the sand. And then when they go bankrupt, they would blame their investors, which you could. There's some of their investors did nonsense. Some of their board members did nonsense. But it was a lack of imagination. So since we're grading on a bell curve, please, bell curve, CBC, there's no way with a clear conscience I can give them a B if I'm giving Washington Post and New York Times and BBC a B. So I'm going to give them a round C. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings with a C minus. And also they had, I forgot, I'm so sorry. And that's the point. They actually did have a streaming service.
Yeah.
And I met them, but the fact that I don't even remember their name and I'm a Canadian tells you a lot. So I'm going to give them a C. I hope there's no big expose coming around the corner, but I give them a C basically.
Right. C for Canada.
C for Canada, C for CBC. There you go. That's the excuse.
Next up, we're going back to print with the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, so the Wall Street Journal was like originally, I think it was the Barton family. I should know this. I'm sorry. Yeah, it was a long time ago. So they sold to Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch had a News Corp. He had like Wall Street Journal, which was like the gold standard of business reporting forever. And around like 2006, 7, 8, he just overbought them, but he just wanted to have it. He wanted it in his portfolio. So he acquired them. And the Wall Street Journal, I think just because they reach a business clientele, meaning you could expense your subscription more easily than you could expense Playboy, or like that's an extreme example, or, Metal Edge, again, I'm dating myself, or many other magazines, right? You can't really expense Cosmo. You can't really expense a lot of other. That's also part of it. That like a lot of the readers of the New York Times are just normal consumers. They're not business. There is a business clientele. So Wall Street Journal was actually a leader in subscription, and their success is what made New York Times and Washington Post go, as consumer behavior changed. So Wall Street Journal, I think I'm going to give them, let me see what we gave the others. Yeah, I'm going to give them a B minus because there's no way that they deserve a C, but there's no way that they get an A for a few reasons. Wall Street Journal could have been a dominant multimedia brand, like really, really dominant multimedia brand, more video, text, everything. But I think that they let way too many others steal a lot of market share and mind share, like Business Insider, which Henry Blodgett started. And Henry Blodgett used to read my first blog, Hip Mojo. He would share it. And frankly, no problem. I mean, this is, again, delusional entrepreneur talk maybe. But what I was covering, the intersection of Madison Avenue and Wall Street and Silicon Valley, and there's one that I'm missing. But anyway, like all those, not just product reviews, he then really executed on with Business Insider, which was not just like TechCrunch or Mashable, like covering the latest product releases. He really covered Silicon Valley, Wall Street, Madison Avenue in a way that I wanted to do, but out of Montreal made no sense. And obviously he was Henry Blodgett. He had both fame, credibility, and infamy because of his previous things that he had done as a analyst at Merrill Lynch. But so the point is, again, focus, Ash. The point is, Wall Street Journal should have never let the Business Insiders, even the CNBCs and many, many others become that big and that, suck out so much energy out of the room. So I do give them a lot of credit for what they've built, but given that they had this business clientele, like they should have really, really been what all these other brands did combined. So they got a B minus.
All right. Next up, we're moving to a magazine with Conde Nast.
So I want to be careful because, again, I actually like Conde Nast quite a bit. I know a few people there, and I really don't mean this in a bad way. And they have done a really, really good job overall to stay relevant, even though you could argue that, their best days are behind them because the glossy era of magazines, 3 martini lunches. And my God, by the way, if you want to see...
That's a whole era that a lot of people miss too, right?
Oh, yeah,
that's a thing. That's a vibe. It really is.
Well, I mean, I do bring it back once in a while when I don't have too many meetings in the afternoon, but let's just put that aside. By the way, if you want to kind of like see an insane proportion of really, really attractive young women, have a meeting at Conde Nast and just pass by the cafeteria. It is just a very attractive landscape. But anyway, let's get back to focus. Conde Nast, whom we also look, I mean, we've talked to every company, so that's just a disclaimer. But I say that because I don't want somebody there being like, oh, he's saying this because we didn't buy the company after we talked. It's really not the point. It's that we talked. I got insights into their vision. I got insights in their pain points. I got insights in what they wanted to do. Conde Nast should have been like owning YouTube. You know what I mean? And they did have some shows. Like they had Vogue, like 72 items in your closet, 87 questions with, like they took the ethos of some of their brands, and they didn't force feed like Vogue to just be Vogue. They actually launched shows, but it was like dropping a little shot of vodka in like a puddle, like a 2-liter bottle of water. Like, what is that going to do, my friends? Like, really, is that going to transform your business? Now, they did recently bring Roger Lynch, who was the former Pandora CEO. Justement, they brought him to kind of like digify what they do. But man, I mean, Conde Nast really had some of the best brands, them and Hearst. I mean, they really, really had like the gold standard of, there you go, that's Mr. Lynch. So they really did have like the gold standard of magazines. So, I mean, I don't want to give them a C. They don't deserve a C. It's like a B minus. Just, it's also not what they've done, by the way. These grades are based on what I believe as an analyst, as a guy that studied all these media companies, even those that existed before I did, the ones after I did. B minus. I did, as a fan of theirs, I did think that they should be a lot more potent today.
I want to ask you before we get to the last entry on the list, what type of business do you think had it the hardest? The TV broadcasters, the newspapers, or the magazine printing companies?
That is such a good question. And this is why I think you have a ton of runway as a podcast host, because that is actually a really nuanced question. And I think context is king. So let's actually take a few minutes on this, because we're almost done the breakdown. And this is actually like 20 years of my experience talking to these companies. So the difference was the broadcast companies, ESPN, MTV, well, even though MTV was cable, but I'm just talking like TV, like broadcast or cable. These guys had the catalog. These guys had the capacity. These guys had the team. These guys had the resources. What they did not have was that economic incentive. Remember that pyramid that I created early on in 2006, where I showed you premium. There's no economic incentive for the big Hollywood kind of players to embrace the web. And then at the bottom, you had UGC that advertisers didn't love, but it was a lot of that content. And we capitalized in that middle, knowing we're not going to kill Hollywood. But if we reinvent storytelling for this audience, we will succeed. And here we are. So the problem with them was not like a lack of capacity, but a lack of desire because of a lack of economic incentive. So they missed the boat. Disney was late. ESPN was late because there was like a mismatch. They got disrupted. So they had it hard because of externalities and because of economic reasons, or almost because of like insecurities and because of like near-term greed.
You're talking about penetrating YouTube specifically, right?
Not just the internet,
including
YouTube, but the internet. Yeah, there you go.
There it is. Yvonne is a master.
Yvonne is a master, yeah. So like there's no reason why ABC, NBC, Fox, or CBS. So these are network, but I mean, I also include cable brands there, ESPN, MTV. There's no reason why those super premium guys were going to embrace digital pennies. Made no sense. So you can't fault them for that. I would be a moron for saying, well, you missed the boat. Well, you didn't miss the boat. You saw the boat. The boat wasn't attractive to you. You didn't see what was there at the end of this journey. So they had their own little pickle. Now, if you are the New York Times, Time, which is magazine, Time launched Pathfinder in the 90s. When I was like a waiter in school, dreaming of the future as God knows what, they had like Pathfinder, but they were early. So they actually, yes, they didn't want to necessarily take their articles and like put it online for free at a time when nobody was paying for content, but they knew that, oh yeah, and digitally, remember what I said? Like we were in the third wave of content. We didn't have to build the infrastructure and worry about distribution. Yeah. But imagine if you're a broadcast company like TV media and you had to like upload files to the internet in 2000. Yeah, my friend, that's not happening. And your dial-up, beep, boop, bop. It's like, yeah, it is not happening, my friend. Whereas the article guys, the text guys, they were like, okay, I just upload this and you just press a button and boom, there it goes. And then Google sends you traffic. Now, yes, people were not paying for traffic. They definitely were early, but they were too early. What did I say in show 1 or 2? You want to be one step ahead of the market and not 5. So they had the desire, the prudent desire, the cautious desire, but they did have the desire. But ultimately, they didn't really have the content. As the world started to shift to audio and video, they got disrupted because people don't really, as much as I love reading, people are not going to sit and read 3,000 word article. So they didn't have the catalog. They didn't really have the expertise for multimedia, because ultimately that's what the web is. The web is multimedia. So who had it harder? It depends on the context. The TV guys had it harder technically early on and harder economically, but the print guys had it harder because they got really in early. The model wasn't there, and they didn't really have the goods. They didn't have video and audio and all this stuff. They just had a lot of articles, which meant they weren't really ready for this like vicious Mortal Kombat Royal Rumble kind of bloodbath that the internet became, especially as multimedia went global.
Yeah, it's true. The print companies had to become multimedia, so that required more of an evolution probably than the TV broadcasters.
That meant a total revolution. Whereas for the broadcast, it was just an evolution.
So I guess there isn't that as much that separates all these companies anymore, right? Because they're all kind of in the same playing field.
There you go. And they all lost to the Google, the Metas, the Apples. They all lost. I mean, basically the world shifted. The power shifted from like the ad supported. And like, I'm not, obviously tech was always dominant, but the media world shifted from media companies to the platforms, which is really in 100 years, they'll look back and be like, oh, wow, that was some kind of revolution. It wasn't like we've had the communication revolution, we've had the technological revolution, we're now doing AI, but they're going to look back at this period and go like, this is when like the power structure shifted from media to tech.
Awesome. Well, we have one more entry left on our list of companies that successfully transformed themselves. And hopefully after this, we can check our poll results. Yep. Those are in. It is The Atlantic.
Yeah, I mean, The Atlantic, the reason why when Chassis suggested this, I left it is because The Atlantic could have really died, right? The Atlantic was like not necessarily the biggest. It wasn't like, it didn't have the reach of like New York Times. It didn't have the credibility of Wall Street Journal. It didn't have the cachet of Washington Post that had broken I believe they had broken the Whitewater, what the Nixon thing. I'm getting old. But they actually transformed themselves into a really, really strong and relevant, digital brand. So that's funny. Like for what they were, I actually give them a B+, because like for what could have happened, they actually kind of punched above their weight. But I feel that like this is also a problem where like, I'm not talking about The Atlantic per se, but sometimes if you're too highfalutin, I believe that's how you pronounce it. Like if you're too shishi, if you're too bougie, if you think your butt doesn't stink, you're going to end up stinking. You're going to be flushed down the toilet. I'm not talking about them, but like the web is like, yeah, you either have to be really global or you have to be really niche if you're Canadian. And so they got to be plus, but at the same time, how relevant is The Atlantic if you really think about it? And anyway, just before we do the poll, some common threads. You do need strong visionary leaders who are willing to put their neck on the line and be digitally fluent. You do need to kind of be willing to diversify revenue streams. I think for a lot of these companies like the New York Times, yes, they had subscription, but they were ad-supported juggernauts, right? They've kind of had a local monopoly. You do need to also like really get data design and UX. So it's not just like good articles. If you're like the New York Times has great UI, a great UI and great UX, user interface, user experience. And then finally, you had to invest in digital talent, right? A lot of these companies, they had a lot of traditional types and traditional middle managers, and they brought in people that had actually, some bona fides in digital businesses.
Cool. Well, that was a good rundown. I like how we reviewed all of those companies, very big names, and interesting to see how far they've come. We have the poll results in now. So we asked, what form of legacy media do you miss the most? And 65% said TV. Radio came in with 21%. Print at 6%, and the early internet with another 6%.
Are you surprised?
No, I said TV. That was my choice.
But isn't this a bit, I don't know if the term is tautology, but isn't this like a self-fulfilling prophecy? Last week, we asked on YouTube, where do you watch your videos? Or like YouTube. This week, we asked video viewers, what do you miss? Shockingly, they said TV. So, okay, a bit of another in hindsight thing, but it's fine. I actually, as I said, magazines, but I do have a nostalgia for early internet. Like I went online when there was the ice storm. That's really when I kind of saw the power.
97, 98?
97 or 98, when basically Montreal shut down. I went to a friend's house and we're like people were like, where are you from, on ICQ or AIM? And I was like, Montreal, like 20 male or whatever. And they're like, oh, isn't there a crazy ice storm? And I was like, oh, wow, I get this. But then even when I started my career at Mama, then Ask Men, and using Hotmail and just like seeing all these things, I was like, oh my God, this is the greatest thing ever. And then it was really like the Yahoos. It was not the company, like the misfits, the rebels, the risk takers. you know, those were the people, and I don't mind that now it's more mainstream, but there was like a idealism, a pureness to it. Whereas now it's like there's a lot more noise, personally.
What did Yvonne say there? ASL?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't random. The point was I was like trying to get information, but then when people would find out I was in Montreal, I would kind of be doing citizen journalism. If you think about it, people would be asking me, what's happening? Is this normal? And yeah, like I remember getting asked that first time ASL. I was like, oh my God, what am I wading into, you know?
Yeah. MSN Messenger is my nostalgia from early internet. That was my, my junior high memories. They're right there. Well, yeah, we'll never have that back again.
I don't want to name it because, again, I don't want to like humble brag, and I certainly don't want if this like the person to be like, oh, I'm going to cancel it. But I may be meeting like an icon next week amongst the companies. Like if I meet him, I will obviously talk about it because this person is one of the quintessential storyteller entrepreneurs, like a category of people I love. It's a person we've covered. I don't want to say too much, but when after one of the meetings, they were like, okay, we definitely should have a follow-up, and this person will likely join. I was a bit starstruck. Like, I won't lie. I was like, oh, really? I was like, I'm looking forward to this meeting. So if it does happen, which is likely, not certain yet, I have to finalize it. We're going to talk a little bit about that because it's like the people that I get starstruck-ish when I see are not the people that normal people get starstruck when they see. Anyway, so just
cool. Well, stay on the call after we wrap because I want to know who that is.
All right, fine.
So to just preview next week's episode, we'll be talking. We're asking the question: what inning are we in? If the internet was baseball, how far are we into the game?
Sure. Yeah.
All right.
Well, I'll give a little tease. It's not about who I'm meeting.
Is it the 7th inning stretch?
No, the bigger question is it a question of what inning are we in? Or is this really a best of 7 series and some games have actually been played and some people have won? And then how far are we? That's, I think, the way I've kind of, in the past, when I've asked that question, that's the kind of dichotomy.
Cool. That'll be interesting because there's a lot of uncertainty in what's to come with the way technology is rapidly advancing. So that should be an interesting conversation.
The only constant is change.
There you go. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you again next week. Are we back to Thursday next week? Or are we going to do Friday again?
You know what? Probable, but not definite yet.
All right. Keep your eyes peeled to the WatchMojo YouTube page, and we'll send updates next week about when the episode is airing. But either way, you'll be able to check it out afterwards on YouTube. So until then, be well. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.